Hi, my name is Husna. I wanted to focus on drugs and controlled substances, specifically tobacco, because I found a lot of interesting things about how tobacco is influencing the Latino community, and we'll explore this further. So, tobacco's tarnishing tactics in the Latino population. First of all, what is tobacco? It's a plant that's grown for its leaves, and it contains nicotine, which can be highly addictive. Nicotine can be consumed in many ways. You can smoke it, chew it, or sniff it, among others. As well as there are e-cigarettes that contain nicotine as well, which we will cover. And so there are severe health effects to consuming tobacco, like lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, or even heart attack. So what leads to tobacco use in the Latino population? Stress is an overarching factor that can lead to tobacco use, but what causes stress? Financial problems do, and poverty, as well as living in unsafe communities, unsafe neighborhoods, places where you may not have familial connections. Unemployment is also a factor that leads to stress, economic stress, and discrimination is another one. And this graphic here at the bottom displays myriad different ways of face discrimination in a different variety of realms. For example, when trying to find a place to live, to raise your family, when trying to find a job, or even when you get that job, when trying to find equal pay or even a promotion at work. These are 31 to 33% discrimination that Latino community faces. And what does stress do? This causes stress, right? But what does stress do? Stress releases cortisol in your system. Increased cortisol can have a lot of health problems. And increased cortisol comes from long-lasting stress. When you're in a stress state at all times, your heart rate is up, you're worried, you might be sweating intensely. This is going to cause a lot of health problems. A lot of research shows that Latinx adults are disproportionately affected by tobacco-related health disease. And so we know from class, we discussed acculturation, but in this situation here, increased acculturation is linked with increased use of tobacco. And so that is something like the Latino paradox that we discussed. So the need to belong and assimilate into the general American culture, the need to absorb the norms and reap the benefits and promises of this new culture really motivates the Latino population to confide in and begin to smoke or continue using tobacco. But when you use tobacco, it also accompanies a lot of other risky activities, such as consuming alcohol. Or when you're smoking, you're going to be working with or maybe living with other smokers, which makes you susceptible to secondhand smoke. But not only you, the people around you, especially children. Tobacco use also accompanies your peers who smoke, as well as being in poor health overall, and could also lead to depression. And 1 in 10 Hispanic or Latino adults currently smoke cigarettes. But what is most interesting here is how nicotine and tobacco use is affecting the youth population, the Latino American youth in the United States. With high rates of poverty and unemployment, with community issues and safety issues, as well as a high school dropout rate, Latino youth are particularly vulnerable to engaging in tobacco use in various forms. And we can see here that e-cigarette use is very high, with 23.2% of high school Latino Americans engaging in e-cigarette use. But even middle schoolers are, as well as 13.1%. So why does this matter? As I mentioned before, the health effects of tobacco are extremely, extremely dangerous, especially for the Latino population, because 43,000 Hispanic and Latino Americans are diagnosed with a tobacco-related cancer every year, and more than 18,000 of those people are dying. But what else does tobacco do besides cancer? It can cause emphysema, shortness of breath. It can cause heart disease. It can increase the risk for leukemia, cataracts, and even type 2 diabetes. But let's not forget about secondhand smoke, because this can also be catastrophic. For adults and children, secondhand smoke can cause coughing, phlegm, reduced lung function, pneumonia, and bronchitis. But children especially are at higher risk to developing a lot of health defects and health-related illnesses from secondhand smoke, such as ear infections, severe asthma, lung infections, and even death for children, especially infants. But I want to put this more into perspective, because as we learned about in class, we learned about the importance of refraining from lumping Hispanic ethnicities into one category when analyzing their health outcomes. So let's take a deeper dive into each ethnicity. one of the highest ones. For example, 29% of Puerto Ricans smoke, which is a higher rate than Dominicans or Central or Southern Americans. In fact, Cubans use more cigarettes and tobacco per day than any other ethnic group who smoke daily. So 50% of Cuban men and 35% of Cuban women report smoking 20 or more cigarettes every day. This other graphic here further exemplifies the need that we really need to assess each subgroup and ethnicity on their own respective level in order to avoid generalizing this Latino population. So as we can see here, Cuban and Puerto Rican smokers are less likely to quit. But what is the grand issue? Why are all of these health outcomes that I mentioned, why is this happening? What is contributing to youth, Latino Americans, increased use of e-cigarette and tobacco, and even adults? It's the tobacco industry and how it's preventing something instrumental, and I'll get to that later. But what is it preventing? Well, let's just go into here first, though. So the tobacco industry targets the Hispanic and Latino community with marketing and advertising. So we can see here in a lot of different tobacco brands, chewing tobacco cigarettes, they're using Spanish language. They're using Spanish phrasing. They're even using Hispanic people on their advertising. And so they're using phrases like Rio and Dorado, but also let's look at these advertisements. We have Newport saying lleno de gusto, meaning full of taste, full of pleasure. It's showing two young Latino individuals engaging in recreational activity and they're enjoying life because of these cigarettes. And this other one here for Winston saying lo tiene todo. He has everything. He has it all because of these cigarettes. He's looking cool here in his, jacket and cigarette. And we can see how, again, this population tobacco industry is exploiting this Latino population by advertising directly towards them. Not only that, the tobacco industry heavily funds Hispanic communities in many spheres, the social sphere, economic sphere, political sphere. And so the tobacco industry has developed coalitions with groups that represent Latino trade unions, for example. The National Council of La Raza, which is very, very influential group in the Latino community, it receives $100,000 from the tobacco industry. And so, for example, Philip Morris is a really big tobacco company. And what Philip Morris did, it sponsored these Mexican rodeos at a cost of $600,000. And this was concentrated at state fairs throughout California. And it was a national tour called the Latin American Spirit, Art and Artists in the United States. So we have political spheres, we have recreational spheres. What about the youth, right? These Latino and Hispanic communities. So the tobacco industry also supports scholarships like the Hispanic Scholarship Fund. Now, this caught me by surprise the most, and it really is one of the main points that is contributing to this issue, because tobacco companies are geographically locating themselves in areas that have a higher concentration of Hispanic and Latino people. But not only that, tobacco companies use price promotions. They enlist discounts on products like cigarillos and little cigars to incentivize this population to engage in tobacco use at a cheaper price. And in a second, we'll take a look at a map that can show you a little bit more about how this concentration works. So everything I mentioned earlier, this prevents successful cessation of smoking. This prevents people, the Latino population, from quitting. How do we address this? So there are a bunch of resources that I found online, and they're really good. And I wanted to share some of the top ones that I found. So first, when we're trying to address the issue of the targeted and dangerous advertising, we need to have some policy implemented. We need to prohibit the sale of tobacco in specific communities like Latino communities. We need to prohibit discounts and offers on tobacco. And instead, we need to raise those prices. So let's take a look at this graph here. So we know that we need policy solutions. We know we need policy solutions to prohibit the location of retailers of tobacco, specifically in Hispanic and Latino communities, because there's a high concentration of retailers in places where there's a high concentration of the Latino community. So we need to really focus on prohibiting the amount of retailers in X location with X amount of concentration. But also there needs to be a minimum distance between retailers because accessibility needs to be reduced in order to reduce nicotine use, as well as with youth. As I mentioned earlier, 23.2% of Hispanic and Latino high schoolers are engaging in nicotine use. Why is that? Because retailers are located in an accessible area, close to schools, close to libraries, places where youth congregate. And so when more retailers are located in an area, the population and their health will suffer. Youth are more likely to start smoking, and people who already smoke are more likely to continue consuming cigarettes and nicotine. Now, how do we address secondhand smoking? There's a lot of educational tools that promote smoke-free households, and we need more of those. We need to disseminate those tools. One great resource is the CDC Toolkit, which provides information on how to protect your children from secondhand smoke, but not only your children, the people around you, such as older adults, individuals who might be immunocompromised, and community members in general. And lastly, let's look at ways to improve smoking cessation. Firstly, the upfront cost to quit smoking is often unaffordable by a lot of populations, specifically the Latino population. And so we need treatments to be covered by insurance companies. Not only that, communities need to work to provide these culturally focused sessions on cessation strategies, but also there needs to be a policy implementation by state governments, local governments that will lower the price of nicotine alternatives to help people quit smoking and instead increase the price of nicotine in tobacco products such as cigarettes and chewing tobacco. And so the CDC has a great resource, which is a hotline for cessation of smoking. It's called 1-855-Déjelo Ya, which means stop already, quit it already. And this is a great resource open 24 hours that is a Spanish language resource that people can call at any time to inform themselves on different resources for the cessation of smoking. So that concludes my presentation here, and I hope you learned something. And the biggest takeaway here that we want to go over is that it's the tobacco industry that produces a very powerful influence on Latino population and how they are unable to cessate from smoking and how the youth are being affected by this. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.